In the last vignette, we were speaking about the necessity of divine revelation and also the contents of divine revelation. The contents today, we refer them as the commandments of Christ or the gospel of Christ. You see, the commandments of Christ are found in the Gospels. And so these two terms should mean exactly the same thing. Then we mentioned to you the fact too that divine revelation contains the way on how to save our souls. That is why it is so important for us to know all the commands of Christ and how to observe them. In fact, before Christ ascended to heaven, it was the only assignment, it was the only reminder that He left to the apostles, that besides going to all nations and proclaiming the good news, they should teach all, not some, but all the commandments of Christ and how to obey them. The sacred doctrines are so important to us because we are supposed to accept them without arguments. That's why in the Catholic Church there are no debates or argumentation, because whenever there is something that is not clear, the only question that we ask is it found in tradition? For instance, today we have debates whether priests can marry or not. The reaction of the Church is simply, is it there in tradition? And if you examine tradition, priests were never allowed to marry. There were cases in which there were married people who later became priests. Now that's okay. If you start with marriage and later on become a priest, that's okay. But to be a priest first and then to marry was never the practice of tradition. So the same thing with the ordination of women. Can we allow this today in our modern times? And the way we answer is, well, let's find out from tradition. What does it say? And clearly, women were never candidates for ordination. Holy Mother of the Church, true mother that she is, sometimes when she sees that her children are having a hard time in obeying the commands of Christ because they had been weakened by their environment, by the world today, she tends to water down or make it easier for them or relax some of the commandments of Christ. Because if the Mother Church impose the whole thing on them, they might break down. And so she tends to relax them. But it is so important for us to know when she relaxes the commands of Christ and when she does not. And the only way to do it is to compare the commands she is giving now with the magisterium of the Church, which we had mentioned in the last vignette. An example of this is, for instance, the teaching on family planning. If you will notice today, the Church allows certain forms of family planning. But if you go back to the tradition of the Catholic Church, it was never allowed. So what was not allowed before is allowed now. So it is good for you to know what has been relaxed. And the reason why it was relaxed, it is because of your weakness. Because the command of Christ has been relaxed, then obedience to that command would not take real effect on your soul. There is really no increase of faith because obedience has been lacking. But sometimes the men of the Church, as it has happened all through the history of the Catholic Church, go overboard in the sense that they really do things just to please man while going contrary to the commandments of Christ. A very good example of this is, for instance, the free granting of annulments of marriages. If you look at these marriages that has been annulled and compare it with the teaching of the Catholic Church in tradition, you will know that those marriages that had been annulled cannot be annulled in the eyes of God. Can you imagine what disaster is this? That couples believing that their marriage is really annulled, remarry, and live in adultery without knowing it. Well, that, even if annulled and approved by the Church, is against the teaching of Christ and therefore remains a sin. The sacred doctrines are really meant to prevent the church and families and individuals from having problems. It is meant to prevent having problems. But sometimes we only apply them when we have problems. Well, that's all right. It can solve the problem, but it will take a little more time. But the real purpose is to prevent having problems, whether in the family level or the level of the church. When the men of the church go overboard, it is because they are ignorant of the contents of the sacred doctrines. And the moment you are ignorant, you cannot keep them. And this is precisely what happened to some of the people that we have referred to in the last vignette. Like Judas, he had the whole contents of divine revelation in his hands with Jesus Christ himself as the teacher, but he was not faithful to the teachings. He entertained greed, and therefore almost immediately he lost his throne and his crown as an apostle. We have seen this also in the choice of the 12 tribes of Israel. One tribe was very unfaithful and they were removed. And the same thing goes with King Saul. You know, when King Saul was chosen as king, God really directly chose him to be the king of Israel. But he was disobedient. The words of Samuel is that he had disobeyed the commands of God. You will recall the time when, doing battle with the enemies, God had commanded him through Samuel to burn everything, the houses and the gold and the property of the enemies. But he kept the gold, not for himself, but to offer as a sacrifice to God. It was at that moment, because of his disobedience, that God abandoned him and chose David in his instead. In God's dealing with man and man's dealing with God, we have to keep in mind that we have to be obedient. It was the mistake of Adam and Eve. It was the mistake of the angels, the mistake of Judas, and the mistake of the 12 tribes of Israel, at least one of them, that they forgot that you always have to be obedient to the express commands of God while cooperating with His divine providence. In the case of King Saul, because it was very obvious to him that he was specially chosen by God, he began to develop what you call the self-will of an independent monarch. It always happens to people who sit down on the highest places. They begin to think that they can do what they want, even if what they do is against the commandments of God. And it was the so-called self-will of an independent monarch that destroyed King Saul. Thinking he was king, he could do anything, even contrary to God's commands. We, all of us, must remember that we should only be ministers to the divine providence of God. His commands, we know we must obey them, but when it comes to divine providence, we are instruments, we are ministers. God may use us for something good or bad. In the mind of God, it is for His glory. We must simply concur with them. When sometimes we experience some signs that we have some spiritual privileges from God, the defect is we immediately exempt ourselves from the obligation of right and wrong. Like these priests who easily annul marriages, they never really sit down to find out whether what they are doing is right or wrong. Obedience to the commands of Christ ought to be very easy, because God had already implanted His entire law in the hearts of men. And then He confirmed it with divine revelation. So we should really easily know the contents of sacred doctrine, and we are bound to obey them. And we have seen in the last vignette what happens to those who are disobedient. Judas was disobedient, changed by Matthias. The Jews, disobedient, changed by the Gentiles. The Eastern Gentiles, disobedient, changed by the Western Gentiles. It is how God acts when you are unfaithful. Now we see Matthias sitting down with the apostles, greatly honored by Christ, as he would greatly honor everyone who is pleasing to him. But we should also be filled with fear, because we can see what could happen to an apostle if he did not fulfill God's will. God bless you.